Welcome to Fantasy Cartography, the show where we see what maps can teach us about fantasy and what fantasy can teach us about maps. On today's episode, I'll begin by taking apart a common cliché of fantasy mapping, and then I'll get really distracted by some largely irrelevant geology. So business as usual, really. Brickworld is my name for one of the most common, cliched, and, in my opinion, boring types of fantasy map. Maybe it's best if I show you some examples. Look at the map of Lord of the Rings. You have a wide ocean with a mostly straight coastline on the left of the map, empty and trackless wastelands on the other three sides, and the middle is mostly a solid block of land. Now look at the map from The Wheel of Time. Wide ocean with a mostly straight coastline on the left and the bottom, insurmountable mountains on the top and the right, solid block of land in the middle. What about Aragon? Wide oceans and straight coastlines on the left, natural barriers on the other sides, solid land in the middle. Exalted, well, we have an island here, but other than that, ocean on the left, barriers on the other sides, solid block of land. Kingkiller Chronicles, much the same. The Dagger and the Coin, Riddle of the Tree Song, Memory, Sorrow and Thorn. It's boring, it's cliched, it doesn't make a lot of geological sense, and I'm pretty sick of it. By my definition, there are three criteria that have to be met before a map can be called a brickworld. Firstly, you have a large ocean that fills one side of the map with a mostly straight coastline facing that ocean. In most brickworlds the ocean is to the west, although in some cases, for example Narnia, you can have an east-facing brickworld. Some series acknowledge the existence of lands on the other side of that ocean, but they can't be the main focus of the action. Secondly, there are natural barriers on the other sides of the map, usually lining up with the page size of the printed edition. Those barriers might be smaller oceans, mountains, deserts, frozen wastes, or just uncharted. Thirdly, the middle of the map is more or less solid lands. There might be rivers, mountains, and small lakes, but there won't be inland seas. It's basically an attempt to cram the maximum possible amount of land onto a standard paperback page, which is why I named it Brickworld. So why is Brickworld so popular? Honestly, the best suggestions that I can come up with are either everyone wants to fit as much as possible onto one page, or alternatively, everyone's mindlessly aping Lord of the Rings. I've read more complex theories, but I don't think they hold water. For example, a lot of people say that the Brickworld maps are aping Europe, but aside from the big ocean to the west thing, Europe doesn't actually look like that. The west coast of Europe is pretty lumpy considering the Iberian Peninsula and the British Isles, and historically, a lot of European culture has been defined by the Mediterranean. I suppose that the west coasts of Australia and the USA are sort of Brickworld-ish, but the western USA at least has the fun of the San Andreas Fault, and Western Australia is specifically known for being incredibly geologically inactive. When your world is less geologically interesting than the least geologically interesting place on Earth, maybe you need to spice it up a little. So, we have a bunch of literary reasons why brickworlds make no sense, but the geology of brickworlds can be pretty bad as well. As a geologist, when I see a solid block of land with ocean on one side, mountains around the edges, and not much going on in the middle, that sets off an alarm bell marked supercontinent. And that's a problem because supercontinents really aren't nice places to live. A supercontinent is exactly what it sounds like, a continent that contains most or all of a planet's continental mass. On Earth, the continents drift together and break apart in a cycle which repeats every 400 to 500 million years. The most recent supercontinent was called Pangaea, which began to break up about 175 million years ago. Let me draw a supercontinent for you to show you why they aren't nice places to live, at least by human standards. We'll use an oval to represent the shape of the Earth. This supercontinent stretches pretty close to both the North and South Poles, which means there'll be quite a lot of temperature variation along its landmass. The supercontinent was formed by collisions between other continents, so we're going to find collision mountain ranges all along its length. That leads to the first problem. There are going to be a lot of earthquakes while the supercontinent is forming, and a lot of volcanism when it's breaking up again. And the climate of the supercontinent is also going to be nasty. With most of the land so far from the ocean, you can expect most of the middle of the continent to be desert. The mountains will make that worse because they'll block rain-bearing clouds and create rain shadows. The coasts will be wet, but probably very swampy and battered by frequent tropical storms and cyclones. Basically, it would be like a gigantic worldwide Australia. And for the record, this shape I've sketched isn't random, it's actually an approximation of Pangaea. No wonder the dinosaurs evolved on this thing, it would have been too tough for anything else. So I get that supercontinents are kind of scary, but there are a couple of saving graces to mention. First of all, even though most brickworlds look like supercontinents from a distance, that doesn't actually mean that they are supercontinents. It's a question of scale. When you look at the map of the entire world of the Wheel of Time series, you can see that the Westlands, where the books mostly take place, is only one part of a single continent. This continent is quite large, slightly larger than Europe, Africa and Asia added together, but it isn't a supercontinent because it doesn't incorporate the majority of the planet's continental mass. The Westlands certainly seem to be the most geologically boring part of the world, but it's pretty clear that they aren't part of a supercontinent. In other cases, where there aren't official maps of the entire world, we have to work off the scale of the map and the travel times in the story. For example, based on a fan estimate that I found in the Inheritance wiki, the total area of Alagacia is about 470,000 square kilometres, which makes it a little bit smaller than Cameroon, or slightly less than twice the size of the UK. Definitely not supercontinent material. I should note that not being a supercontinent doesn't mean that these maps aren't brickworlds, they're just very boring smaller continents. It's also worth pointing out that some fantasy worlds started out as brickworlds, but have since been saved from that pile by continued literary development. At the beginning of Pawn of Prophecy, the first book of the Belgariad, the world looks quite brickish, but towards the end of that series, David and Lee Eddings had put a lot of work into building up the world, and so we had two similarly sized continents with some reasonably interesting coastlines and islands to boot. Something similar happened to the Forgotten Realms setting for Dungeons & Dragons. The Sword Coast, the first region to be developed for the setting, is one of the most boring brickworlds I've ever seen, but as the Realms setting grew in popularity, extra parts were added to the continent of Faerun, and the inland parts are much more interesting. Granted, the Sword Coast still has horribly boring geology, and Faerun is probably large enough to be considered a supercontinent, but at least it has some inland seas to help it cool off. And talking of which, Pangaea pretty much is or was the worst case scenario for a supercontinent. It's possible to imagine a supercontinent which is much nicer to live on. Let's sketch another one. This time it stretches east to west instead of north to south, so there's a lot less temperature variation. Let's give it a big inland sea here to keep things cool, and let's say that one continent hasn't joined in the party, so it's floating over to the south as a big island. Some of the problems with Pangaea are endemic to all supercontinents. Every supercontinent is going to be battered by tropical storms and cyclones, and there are always going to be pretty large inland desert areas. But on this particular supercontinent, the land around that inland sea should receive a decent but not excessive amount of rain, and you can expect fertile lands around its coast. And life on that southern continent is going to be pretty nice. It'll be surrounded by pleasant ocean currents to help keep the seasons moderate. And of course, there's another twist. This is Christopher Scatizza's reconstruction of what Earth's next supercontinent will look like in 250 million years or so. So if you really wanted to play the "this is Earth but way in the future" card, it might be interesting to use this map. Just be sure to pay attention to the climate. And if you'd rather create an original fantasy map, don't focus too much on the west coast, don't worry too much about natural barriers, and for pity's sake, put in some inland seas. That's it for this episode of Fantasy Cartography. Please stay until after the credits for the unrelated interesting fact of the day. Please subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon, and like this video if you learned anything. The full script is available on fantasycartography.tumblr.com. You can ask me questions with the Tumblr Ask box, or by using Facebook or Twitter or Carrier Raven. If you think I've made any mistakes, or if there's anything you'd like me to expand on, then please email me at fantasycartography@iinet.net.au. Until next time, may your fantasy be cartographic, and your cartography be fantastical. When when the Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia series were new, since Middle-earth has a western coast with no defined eastern edge, and Narnia has an eastern coast with no defined western edge, both Tolkien and Lewis had to specifically deny that the two series were set on opposite coasts of the same continent. So there's yet another reason to avoid Brickworlds. Put your series on the west coast and everyone will think it's connected to Narnia. You don't need that kind of reputation, guys. Or if there's anything you'd like me to expand on... Expand?